is our huge pleasure today to be speaking with Dr. Robert Ferris. Dr. Ferris is Professor Emeritus at Columbia International University for 21 years. The Ferrises served as missionaries in the Republic of the Philippines, where Bob taught at FEBIAS College of the Bible, directed the Philippine Association of Bible and Theological Schools, and served as Dean of Asian Theological Seminary. Dr. Ferris is the author of the text that we'll be discussing today, Renewal in Theological Education, Strategies for Change, originally published in 1990. Dr. Ferris, we're very grateful to be speaking with you today.
It's my pleasure.
Dr. Ferris, in your book, Renewal in Theological Education, Strategies for Change, this book came as the fruit of your research in 1988 to 89 as missionary scholar in residence at the Billy Graham Center in Wheaton. Would you be willing to tell us what led you to embark on this research project from your perspective?
Yes. When I was appointed Graham Center missionary scholar in residence, the Graham Center wanted its scholars in residence to publish a book during the year that they were at Wheaton. What today is known as I Set was founded in 1980, and in 1981, the following year, there was a consultation held in Malawi at which Paul Bowers proposed the development of a manifesto on renewal in theological education. His concern was that the theological education by extension folks and the residential folks were emphasizing differences between them rather than the things that they held in common. And he was persuaded that there was a great deal that both could affirm. And so he was given the assignment of developing a manifesto on evangelical theological education. The process by which that manifesto was developed is outlined in the book that we're discussing today. At the time, I served as executive director of Philippine Association of Bible Theological Schools, and I was one of about 24 theological educators on all continents who received copies of a draft, which Paul produced. And I contributed generously in my comments on the draft, that draft, and on a subsequent draft, and found that many of my contributions were incorporated into the final document. That document was accepted by the ISET board in 1983, and I went to the Graham Center in 1988, 5 years later, and was of the opinion, it was my perception that the manifesto had not received the attention that it was due, and consequently my desire was to explore how the manifesto had been used and accepted during the 5-year interval between 83 and 85.
Dr. Ferris, the principles of the I Set Manifesto are the following 12: contextualization, church-focused orientation, strategic flexibility, theological grounding, continuous assessment, community life, integrated programs, servant molding, instructional variety, a Christian mind, equipping for growth, and lastly, cooperation. From the 242 schools that you surveyed, did you find that the majority of schools were especially successful in applying certain of these principles? And on the other side, did you find that there were certain principles that most schools found particularly challenging? Thank you.
Well, actually, the values expressed in the manifesto were broadly affirmed in the survey. One of the most revealing findings of the survey, however, was that nearly 85% of the respondents indicated that they weren't aware of the manifesto. So the manifesto itself, it seems, was a rock thrown into a pond that made no ripple. Um, the But when presented with the values articulated in the manifesto, the theological educators strongly affirmed those values. They indicated that they had attempted to implement those values in their institutions, but they also indicated that their realization of those values within their institution was somewhat below their level of commitment. So what we had a situation where people were committed to values which they had been unsatisfied with their ability to implement, and interestingly, didn't seem to know anybody else who had done better.
Dr. Ferris, you wrote this text, Renewal in Theological Education, Strategies for Change, in an effort to help schools receive the message of the manifesto. Now, at a date of almost 35 years after the original publication of the manifesto in 1983, do we have enough historical distance to do an autopsy? Why was it that the manifesto didn't have the effect that it was intended to have in the early years in these schools' lives?
I'm not sure. I don't know that we can identify anything more clearly today than we did then. The manifesto, I don't know that the findings would be significantly different today if we repeated this study. I think that again we'd find that people largely, the school administrators, theological educators largely are unaware of this manifesto, that they affirm the values of the manifesto, that they've attempted to implement those values, and that they're not satisfied with the way that with the results that they've seen in their institutions. Perhaps the interesting thing is that even in Actea, the organization that Paul Bowers at the time was leading, there were a number of institutions that said they'd not heard of the manifesto 5 years after it was published. So we really didn't do a very good job of getting the word out, it seems.
Dr. Ferris, would you be willing to retrace, as much as you may have personal experience with the history of I Set, where did this institution come from? Whose idea was it to produce I Set, the International Council for Evangelical Theological Education, this umbrella group over these other 8 regional accreditation agencies? And what was the mission precisely that the creation of this new organization was attempting to fulfill?
Well, Jonathan, the background is documented in the book that we're talking about today. There was a number of calls for renewal in theological education that antedated the founding of I Set. The first movement within the World Evangelical, what today is the World Evangelical Alliance, was the creation of the Theological Education Commission, and the call for renewal existed within the Theological Education Commission. It was the commission that actually called the consultation in Hoddesdon, England, where I Set was founded. In the interim, just in the years just prior to the founding of I Set in Hoddesdon in 1980, there were associations of theological education that were accrediting associations that were established in Asia, in Africa, in the Caribbean, and it seemed reasonable that there should be some coordinating body that would bring these together, and that was really the impetus for establishing I Set. I Set then held consultations in 1981, 1984, 1987, And as people came to learn about I Set, the participation in the work in the consultations grew until in 1985 or 19 rather in 2015 in Turkey. I believe you were there. There were what, over 200 delegates, maybe over 300 delegates that were at that consultation. So.
What was it about the manifesto precisely that you identified as deserving further attention and further exploration?
Well, the manifesto is a call for renewal, and I may be getting ahead of the story a bit, but when I went to Phoebus College of Bible, Phoebus, by the way, is like Biola. Biola was originally the Bible Institute of Los Angeles. Phoebus was originally the Far East Bible Institute and Seminary. That's how it got its name. So when I went to Phoebus to teach, I was looking for a better way to teach. And in the early 70s, I got involved in the Theological Education by Extension movement. And I found in Theological Education by Extension a community of people who were all looking for a better way to teach. And the problem was that in the Philippines, at least, and I think more broadly as well, that all of us were trained theologically and none of us was trained educationally. And the issues that we were facing really were not theological problems. We knew how to do our exegesis. We knew how to do our theology. We knew how to deal with the theological issues. What we didn't know how to do is how to deal with the educational issues. And it was that was the impetus for the call. That was the source out of which the call for renewal was growing. Many people were recognizing that the schooling approach to education was not serving us well, and we needed to do something different. We were developing leadership for the global church, and that desire to do better was really the well out of which the spring out of which the call for renewal grew, and because I Set had adopted this agenda of renewal in theological education, I was happy to be part of it.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris, for those reflections. Dr. Ferris, since 2003, you've served with GATE, that is Global Associates for Transformational Education, in the mission of advancing quality theological education worldwide. Please tell us about your strategic decision to become one of the founding members of GATE.
Well, that really continues the story that we just began, because as when I was teaching at Phoebus, Dr. Ted Ward from Michigan State University came to Phoebus one day and did a faculty workshop for us. And I immediately connected with him, this man. He was an astute thinker. He was quick to put his finger on issues. And I decided that if I were going to do something in the area of education, he's the person I'd like to work with. And so in 1977, I went to Michigan. I enrolled at Michigan State University in a doctoral program in educational administration and curriculum. And basically, that was a turning point in my career, because prior to that time, my training had been in theology. And the interesting thing was that at Michigan State University, I wrote theological papers for my secular education profs, and they loved them because there was a clear sense of there was clarity about values, and there was a philosophical engagement, what they saw as a philosophical engagement with educational issues. And this blending of theology and education is the thing which, if I have been able to make a contribution at all, it has been in this, because of this blending of theology and my theological interests and my educational interests. When I returned to the Philippines after completing the coursework for that degree in 1980, that's when I was called to work with the Philippine Association of Bible and Theological Schools. And in that role, I traveled the length and breadth of the Philippines. We had, I think, 45 Bible schools and seminaries that were members of Philippine Association of Bible and Theological Schools at that time. And I spent the next 4 years doing faculty workshops, regional seminars, national conventions, editing a quarterly bulletin, and basically investing my ministry in trying to strengthen theological schools in the Philippines. When I came, then I was asked to take up the deanship of Asian Theological Seminary, and continued to implement at ATS the things that I'd been talking about with other schools in the Philippines in my role with PABATS. In 1988, we came back to the States, and that's when I was at the Graham Center. In '89, we were expecting the Lord to send us into another ministry in international theological education, and instead he led us to Columbia Bible College and Seminary. At Columbia Biblical Seminary, I taught a course on non-traditional approaches to ministry education, drawing on both my work in renewal of theological education and my background in theological education by extension. The amount of material that we had I had to choose what I was going to incorporate in that class was so vast that we decided we really needed to offer an MA in International Theological Education. And we actually graduated a handful of students from that MA International Theological Education program. But what became evident is that the people who were looking for training in international theological education already had master's degrees. What they needed was a doctoral degree. And so our initial effort was to develop a PhD in international theological education in collaboration with University of South Carolina, because there in international theological education, there is some value in having a degree that's issued by a secular institution. That didn't work out, and it really was not feasible for us to develop a PhD program at Columbia at that time. And so our effort was redirected towards a non-formal approach to addressing the needs that we saw. And conversations that started in the year 2000 actually took form in 2003 as we began planning for GATE. And the first GATE workshops was held in Kyiv, Ukraine, in 2004. So that's kind of the pathway that brought me into GATE.
Excellent. That's extremely helpful. Thank you. Dr. Ferris, some are talking about abandoning government-recognized forms of accreditation for institutions of theological education and instead pursuing some form of certification that could be recognized by global church bodies. What would your counsel be on this matter?
I think that it's common for people to assume that out in the ether somewhere there exists a Platonic ideal of what good education, good seminary education should be. But as soon as I say that, we realize that is not true. And accreditation is assumed to be the comparison of concrete institutions here on terra firma with that Platonic ideal. But if the Platonic ideal doesn't exist, then we realize that what's happening instead is that the standards of accrediting associations, accrediting agencies, really represent somebody's idea of what the values are, what educational values should be, and what constitutes good education. Now, to the extent that the values ascribed by the accrediting association overlap with the values to which God has called a particular institution, to that extent, accreditation will strengthen the institution. But to the extent the values of the institution diverge from the values of the accrediting association, accreditation will have the effect of drawing the institution away from its own values in the direction of the agency. And that therein lies the problem. Because accrediting agencies typically orient towards the secular university. And the values of the secular university are very different from the values that drive ministry education today, or at least the biblical values that should drive ministry education. And consequently, it's very, very important for schools to think carefully before they submit themselves to accreditation by an agency which is driven by values that are not at all biblical and which tend to press the institution to exhibit those values as well.
Dr. Ferris, what do you see as the greatest opportunities and challenges facing global theological education today?
Let's start with the challenges. And I'm going to be very direct here. There's no question that the most urgent challenge facing theological education in the majority world today is the issue of funding. And there are a number of factors that contribute to that. First of all, there is no school, university, or college, at least not a graduate, tertiary level institution, that is financially viable apart from infusions of funding, whether those infusions come from endowments, which some schools, Western schools, have in abundance, whether those infusions come from donations by donors, whether those come from wherever they come from, the schools cannot run on the tuition that the income that the school itself generates. This is a problem for schools because what is the school in the developing world supposed to do? What does the school in the majority world do? Does it come to the West and raise funds in the West in order to underwrite the cost of its program? That's not a good solution. It creates dependencies which are unhealthy, and it leaves the institution oriented towards the donors in the West rather than towards the church that it's allegedly to serve. There's a number of schools, especially in Africa, that have broadened the scope of their institutions to become universities. And that's problematic as well. Because as soon as you broaden the scope of your programs to include arts and sciences, you have to have faculty members who are qualified to teach in the arts and sciences. And there's not that many evangelicals who have academic qualifications in the arts and sciences. Consequently, in order to meet the demands of ministries of education and accrediting agencies, these schools hire non-evangelical professors in the arts and sciences. And quickly, the arts and science programs begin to grow, and they grow. It doesn't take long before they're larger. The enrollments in the arts and sciences is greater than the enrollment in the theological studies. And faculties in the arts and sciences are more numerous than the faculties of the theological studies. And at that point, the whole orientation of the institution shifts. And what started out as an institution intended to serve the church ends up very much like Harvard University, Yale Divinity School, Yale University, Princeton, University of Chicago, all of which were started to train pastors, and today are doing little or nothing to promote that goal. And it really troubles me to see schools in the majority world that are embracing the move towards university programs. So if we're going to address the issue of funding, the thing that we've got to do is find ways to develop domestic sustainability. But that demands major change. That demands rethinking the way that we go about training, who is involved in training, how people are involved in training. And so if we're talking about challenges, that has to be considered. Because of the urgency of it, that has to be considered a major challenge. Another challenge is reorienting the university from the values of the university, the seminary rather, from the values of the university to the values of the church. Ministry leadership is not, university leadership is elitist. Church leadership should not be elitist. Jesus' model was a servant leadership, and that's what he calls for, and that's what our schools need to develop. But reorienting the institution from a scholastic and scholarly orientation to a ministry and servant orientation is another major challenge. And then implicit in both of these is retooling the faculty to teach, not just for transfer of information, but for transformation of life and ministry. So these it seemed to me, are the primary challenges facing the church. As far as opportunities are concerned, well, the status quo is unsustainable, and consequently, realities are going to force change. The biggest impediment to change at this point probably is the willingness of the Western Church to fund global theological education. If the Western Church would back off on funding, then the church in the majority world would find sustainable ways to train its ministers. So that's an opportunity, but it's also an opportunity that is deferred at this point because of the way that the Western Church is engaging the church in the global church.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris, for sharing those reflections. Dr. Ferris, we understand that you are producing a new book, tentatively titled Ministry Education That Transforms. Would you be willing to share with us for a few moments about that project that you're currently working on?
Yeah, the book lays out the challenge facing theological educators in the global church, specifically regarding teaching for life and ministry transformation. And it offers practical direction in addressing these challenges. It is brief, but that about summarizes what the book's about.
Good. So I guess we need to wait till it's released to get a hold of the book until we hear more details?
Well, this is not a book that is primarily about methods or techniques that can be immediately applied. It is a philosophical and theological reflection on the state of the church, and brings to bear as well educational research and theory that addresses the issues of ministry training for life and ministry transformation. Basically what the book does is it reflects the work that's gone into developing the GATE workshops and that have been so beneficial to faculties in many parts of the world.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Ferris, if I may close with a question that we've been asking all of the participants in this interview program, and that is, what would it mean for the church to be united today? How would we recognize this unity, and what is it that we can do as Christians today to pursue the unity for which Jesus prayed in John 17?
Well, Jonathan, it seems to me that the biggest problems with respect to unity, as I have had an opportunity to interact with church leaders on every continent, that the problems that we experience are of our own making. There's so much of a tendency for us to build our own kingdoms rather than Christ's kingdom, to burnish our own image, and the way of Christ is the path of servanthood, and that was the topic that I addressed in my doctoral dissertation at Michigan State University. That developing servant leaders for the church is a huge concern for me, and the absence of a commitment to servanthood, I think, is one of the biggest impediments to unity in the church. The other thing that I would like to call for is for us to make space for one another, for differences of opinion, for us to be less dogmatic. Now, we need to test truth claims. There's no question about that. And the good news is that biblically, truth claims can be tested. We need to be able to recognize heresy when we encounter it. But most of the things that divide us as evangelical Christians are not issues of heresy. They're simply differences within the family. And we need to be able to make space for one another, to accept one another's perspectives, to honor one another, to respect one another, to speak kindly of one another, rather than speaking harshly or dogmatically or separating ourselves from one another. These are my concerns.
It's been our delight today to be speaking with Dr. Robert Ferris, Professor Emeritus at Columbia International University, and also author of the text that we've been discussing, Renewal in Theological Education, Strategies for Change. Dr. Ferris, thank you so much for sharing your morning with us.
It's been my pleasure.